Hey everyone, I'm here with Meryl Herr. Meryl is a nonprofit consultant and the author of When Work Hurts, Building Resilience When You're Beat Up or Burnt Out. Meryl was also, until recently, the Director of Research and Resources at the Max De Pree Center for Leadership, of which the Church Leadership Institute and the Spiritual Life and Leadership podcast is also a part. We're under the De Pree Center for Leadership. So, Meryl, welcome. Thanks for being
Thank
here.
you. Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Meryl, tell us briefly what you do.
Yeah, so right now I am the owner and solopreneur of a nonprofit consulting business that focuses on educational program planning and evaluation. So I work with nonprofit clients to really make their educational programs awesome and really
Hmm.
effective. And that takes a lot of different shapes. So that's what I do. I also write on my Substack and
Hmm.
talk about work hurt and
Yeah.
employee well-being quite a bit.
Hmm.
And as we're recording this, we're in the throes of the end of the school year. My kids
Hmm.
have just a little over 2 weeks of school left, last soccer
Yeah.
games of the season. So we're in the
Yeah.
thick of it, but it's a
Yep.
lot of fun.
Yep. That's awesome. Awesome. Well, I'm excited to talk about your book and to talk about work hurt. As I was reading it, my brain would often say church hurt because that's kind of a thing that gets talked about a lot too. And there's some similarities, I think, as I was reading. But um, maybe I'd love to start just by you sharing your own story, your experience of work hurt, and how that informed then kind of led you to the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, I'll try to be as brief as possible, but give enough context for the listeners. So, I would say that pretty early on in my career, I was a little bit disillusioned by work not turning out quite like I had anticipated.
Mm.
So, I thought that work for me was going to be, go to school, get a job, you know,
Hmm.
excel, climb the ladder. And by my early 30s, that was not really happening.
Mm.
I had gone from college to seminary to a 2 year pastoral residency, which
Mm.
ended right in the middle of the Great Recession. And so
Mm.
both my husband and I had trouble finding work after that. And then once he got a job, I had a very long season of unemployment and underemployment, which was really discouraging. And I describe that situation in the book and talk about how I was watching Jerry Springer to soothe myself in that time. But I've also lost a job, which was
Mm.
really, really unexpected and painful.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I've just had different kinds of frustrations and disappointments along the way with work. And I think after a while, I got to the point where I started talking to the Lord and praying about writing a book. And part of that prayer conversation ended up, well, you're kind of, I mean, wouldn't say I'm like totally healed from all the work hurt, but in a
Yeah.
place where I could serve other people out of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's kind
Yeah.
of what got me there.
Yeah. That's good. I've experienced my own work hurt. I've been fired from at least two jobs. One was as a young man in a job that I was just not a good fit for, very detail oriented. I'm not very detail oriented. The other one was from a church where there were some people who were kind of against me and just stirred things up and made life really difficult and got voted out by a margin of 2 votes. That was, gosh, coming up on 10 years ago, 9 years ago, 8, 9 years ago now. But anyway, both of them very painful. The second one more than the other. But what that got me thinking of is there are different kinds of things that could lead to church hurt. Like, and you kind of addressed this, but in my case, I was thinking, okay, one was just a bad fit, and it just created a difficult experience for me, which led to them saying you're not the right fit for this. And the second was just interpersonal, like people who didn't like me. So I wonder if you could talk about just work hurt. Uh, Maybe different kinds of work hurt or different kinds of experiences of work hurt, and just explain what work hurt then is. And yeah.
Yeah, it's really good. So actually, a question earlier this week prompted me to go back to my book and say, did I actually define work hurt in there? And I don't know that
Mm.
I did a great job. So I've been trying to
Uh-huh.
remedy that through some writing and talking about it lately. But
Yeah.
I would say work hurt is any physical or psychological injury
Mm.
we sustain in our occupation.
Mm.
So that's my short definition. And so when we say that, like physical injury or psychological injury, my book mainly is focusing on the like stress related injuries or emotional,
Right.
psychological
Right.
damage and trauma that we can experience from work. But I don't want to minimize the physical
Mm.
injuries at all because those are very
Yeah.
real for many people in their
Mm.
occupations today. Um, and I'm going to parse it out in a couple of different ways. So, you brought up the couple of things. There's an issue of fit in one
Mhm.
job. Maybe there was some interpersonal conflict in another one.
Mhm.
So in the book, I talk about one uh, maybe one environment that really breeds work hurt is toxic systems and unhealthy cultures. And so we find ourselves in those places, maybe where there is an unhealthy manager or
Mhm.
some cultures that are unjust or
Mm.
oppressive. And so I think that is actually a huge piece of work hurt that we
Yeah.
experience. But then there are also ways that we can contribute to our own work hurt. That could be like through an issue of fit. And in the book, I talk about our job fit, organization fit, work
Mhm.
environment fit, which are all different terms that we get out of the industrial organizational psychology and management fields.
Yeah.
But even like our own mistakes, right?
Mhm.
Like we can make a mistake that could end up getting us fired, or
Right.
we could transgress a particular policy or
Yeah.
have an ethical violation. Those things can lead to work hurt ultimately. And we have to really sift through and figure out, well, in what ways am I complicit? In what ways is the organization or a particular person there complicit? So that's one way I want to parse it
Yeah.
out. And then I'm going to talk about three different categories of work hurt I write about in the book. That's disappointment, disillusionment, and devastation. So,
Mm.
disappointment, there's a range. So, this is when work doesn't meet up to our expectations.
Yeah.
And, it could be a minor disappointment, like, oh, I'm so
Mm.
mad that such and such left their dishes in the common sink area in the kitchen, right?
Mhm.
That's like a minor
Mhm.
disappointment, frustration all the way to like I didn't get that promotion I had been hoping for. That's a big
Right.
disappointment, right?
Yeah.
Disillusionment is when something happens at work, it really rattles your deeply held assumptions
Yeah.
about the way that the world of work operates. So I think about someone I talked to prior to writing the book who was sexually harassed at work.
Mm.
And for her, she was totally disillusioned like, oh, I really didn't have the category for my boss acting like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And then you've got devastation. And that's when work just levels you with some kind of
Mm.
grief. That's the getting fired, the getting laid
Yeah.
off, I think. And for different people, the disillusionment, disappointment, and devastation, there's some overlap in those.
Mhm.
And we all have a different level of tolerance. So what's really disappointing to you might be devastating to me.
Right. That's helpful. So the 3 again, what did you say? Disappointment, disillusionment, and
Disappointment,
devastation?
disillusionment, and
And
devastation.
devastation. And how widespread, I mean, I don't know if you have, like, research on this, but how widespread is the experience of work hurt, do you
Yeah,
think?
so I'll just rattle off a few stats that I
Okay.
have here, and we'll go back to the pandemic. So it gives us like a
Oh,
5 year spread or so. So
okay.
with the COVID-19 pandemic, 20 million people lost their jobs at the start of the pandemic. Great resignation, which was shortly after that, 4 million people per month were quitting their jobs. And in
Mm.
my book, I go to some of the research that talks about why people were leaving. As
Yeah.
of 2024, so last year, 25% of employees in the US felt burnt out at some
Mm.
point in their work.
Yeah. Yeah.
1 in 5 employees globally have experienced harassment at work.
Hmm.
According to Gallup, only 31% of employees report being engaged in their work. That's a
Mhm.
10-year low.
Hmm.
And then I recently came across some Pew research on discrimination at work, which were really sobering. So, this is a February 2023 study by Pew, and I'm going to quote directly. Black workers are the most likely to say they've been discriminated against in the workplace because of their race or ethnicity. Some 41% of Black workers say that at some point they have experienced discrimination or been treated unfairly by an employer in hiring, pay, or promotions because
Mm,
their race or ethnicity, though not necessarily by their current employer. This compares with only 8% of white workers, 20% of Hispanic workers, and 25% of Asian workers. And while about a quarter of employed women say that they've experienced discrimination because of their gender, only 1 in 10 employed men say the same thing.
wow. Wow.
Those stats just really were so shocking. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
not shocking in some ways
Yeah.
because we know the way the world works, unfortunately, that there is
Yep.
so much injustice, inequity, and discrimination that's often baked into the workplace systems. But to see how many people have experienced that in their
Yeah.
work, and then that's part of their reality, is really shocking to me.
Yeah. That's a lot. Um, and certainly more for some groups of people than for others, which is not right, but a world that we need to continue to pray for and try to bring healing and justice into. So, so in light of that, then all of the work hurt that many of us are experiencing, what do we do? Like, how do we process that? And let me just mention one of the things that you do is you quote from Richard Rohr, where you say, "If we don't transform our pain, we will transmit it." And so maybe kind of I love that. I think that's really helpful. So the question is, what do we do with the hurt that we've experienced from work?
Yeah, I think our default is to just kind of stuff it inside and put on a smiley face and keep going,
Hmm.
because so many of us are working for reasons more than just personal fulfillment, right? We're trying to put food on the table and serve others and,
Yeah.
build a career. And so we just might try to muscle through it. But that's actually not helpful because if we don't like own up to that pain, acknowledge it, and start to process it, I think it does come out. It can come out in cynicism at work.
Mm,
It can
mm,
come out in projecting certain things onto a manager or a coworker based on
yeah.
past experiences. It can come out on your kids. Like I've experienced that when I've had moments where I have been really, really stressed at work.
Hmm.
I just am a total awful person to my kids. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with their behavior.
Yeah.
It's just because I haven't dealt with the pain and frustration that I've had at work. And so we
Yeah.
need to be really careful that we don't transmit it because it can hurt ourselves, right? There's all kinds of
Hmm.
stress related illnesses that come from not processing negative emotion. And then it can also hurt the people we love. It can hurt our
Hmm.
careers. I mean, it's just really damaging. And so we've
Yeah.
got to take care of it.
Yeah. And I mean, how do we do that? How do we begin to do that work of taking care of it?
Yeah,
Um,
I think it's a really good question. So I lay out a ton of strategies in the book, but I think some of the ones that I keep coming back to are community. You've got to have a group of people who love and care for you, who are going to tell you the truth and show you care and compassion to walk with you through that. You need to be able to tell someone how you were hurt at work. You need to be able to receive care.
mhm,
And part of that community may be a licensed mental health professional. I think a lot of
mhm,
people can really benefit from therapy in the wake of their work hurt. I think prayer is really important, and not just any type of prayer, specifically prayer of lament
yeah.
is
Mhm,
really good for being able to bring our honest and raw hurts to God and ask
yeah.
Him to see and to redeem in those situations. So those are a couple of pieces that I think are really,
Yeah.
really important. But then we have to figure out, what does it look like to move forward? What does it look
Mhm,
like to continue to work well, even though I've experienced something really, really challenging at
yeah.
work? And depending on our situations, that's going to be look a little bit differently. So if you're stuck in a toxic work environment and can't get out, right? You've got the harm, you're
Mhm,
continuing to live it. Working well is going to look differently for you than someone who's on a job
yeah.
search versus, someone who's maybe starting a new job. And so or maybe is in a vocational discernment phase. And so I go through all those scenarios in the book. And so there will be some individual differences. But again, the through threads for those are community, prayer, and then one that I left out, which is so important, is just continuing to listen to God and pay attention to God's presence in your life.
Yeah. Say a little bit more about that. Listening to God and paying attention to His presence. What does that look like, or how does that help? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in the book, I write a lot about this concept of calling or vocation, which we toss around a lot in Christian circles, and the scriptural understanding of calling, as I look at scripture, is this idea that God is inviting us to participate in His work in the world using the gifts and skills that He has given us. And the very sense of the word vocation and call is it's something that's heard, right? We may not always hear it audibly, but we can discern it. And I liken that discernment process to wayfinding. This idea that we get from the cultures of the Pacific Islands, that to be able to navigate from place to place, you may not have a GPS that's going to say turn here, turn here, turn here. You pay attention to the swells of the sea and the direction of the wind and the pattern of the stars in the sky and where the sun sets and the moon rises. And so you're attentive to everything that's around you as you're trying to navigate from one place to the other. And I think so much of this calling of listening to God for us is really cultivating the ability to discern God's movement all around us. And that means discerning and understanding who God's made us to be, right? Like understanding ourselves, learning to listen to what the voice of God is going to sound like. It's going to sound a lot like the God that we see in scriptures, who is talking about love and justice and mercy and compassion. And to pay attention to the world, like what's going on in the world around us, and where do we see an invitation to serve and to partner with God. And so, this listening to God, I was thinking about it the other day. It's a process that's like cultivated over time, right? It's not like one morning you wake up when you're like 18 and all of a sudden you can just listen to God super profoundly. It's you cultivate this practice over a lifetime. And I think of the ways that I've learned to discern God's presence, God's leading, God's call in certain situations has really evolved over the course of my life.
That's good. I love, and it's helpful, like, to think about listening to God in terms of listening to His call, and like you said, vocation, calling. These are God speaking and us listening and going, and it took just my own reflection here. When I was a kid, I thought of vocation as like, oh, it's just a job. We had Votech right at our high school, which was like, the kids who wanted to learn how to be mechanics and whatever, those kinds of more hands-on kinds of jobs. They went to vocational technology. I'm like, oh, vocation means just a job, but it's certainly more than that. It's right. It's like you're saying, it comes from the word voice, right? And vocal, and it's related to all that, which is really helpful to me because, and of course, as a pastor, I'm a Presbyterian pastor. We talk about our jobs as calls, right? You discern your call. The call that I'm in right now is at this church, The challenge is when you go through something difficult, you have some kind of work hurt, then you go, wait, but I thought I was called to this. I had this experience. I'll just share real briefly. When I got voted out of that church, I was meeting with some of our elders kind of after it had all happened, and some of the very supportive ones. And And I said to them, man, I thought that this is where God wanted me. I thought that he'd called me here. And then one of our elders, who was kind of a young woman, she started crying, and I was like, oh my gosh, what's wrong? And she said, if you hadn't been at this church, I wouldn't have become a Christian. And I was like, oh, okay, I get it. I was called here, but then this happened, because there's evil and brokenness in the world. So anyway, talk a little bit about like the feeling that we should be perhaps exempt from pain and suffering in our jobs if we are called to it.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there's this romanticism that happens around the concept of calling, that
Mhm.
even like purpose, that if God has called me somewhere, then suffering is not going to be part of it, because God's just going to make it so smooth and pave the way, and everything's going to be smooth sailing. But I mean, I just go back to Jesus to refute that, because
Yeah.
right, Jesus was called to a very particular task here on earth, and look how
Hmm.
much of it required tremendous suffering,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Relational, the physical suffering. I think of the Apostle Paul, right? Like
Yeah.
shipwrecked, flogged, all the things. Like we can list all the things that he lists that happened to him and his traveling companions, all because they were called to share the gospel. So
Hmm.
a call does not exempt us from hardship. It does
Yeah.
not exempt us from people who are going to thwart that call. In fact, I think scripture is pretty clear that we are fighting against spiritual powers, right? So if we are
Yeah.
partnering with God and God's work in the world, and that is in any type of occupation, from being a pastor to a painter to an architect to a custodian, whatever we are in, if we are partnering with God's work in the world,
Yeah.
we can expect that there is going to be some points of contention there, because there is a power in the world that is opposed to the flourishing of the gospel and
Mm.
to God's redemptive work.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. That's helpful. And I was also thinking that the experience of work hurt is kind of a pastoral issue as well, right? Maybe just talk about that, whatever thoughts you have on that. How can we, as pastors, pay attention to what's going on in our, parishioners' lives, and then serve them if they're going through some kind of church hurt experience?
Yeah, I think it's so important to equip pastors for understanding work hurt. I mean, I'll be one that's going to advocate for pastors understanding the work lives of their
Hmm.
congregants in general. I think that's really important, because work is such a primary place for formation and for redemptive impact in the world. But I would say, the statistics I read off just a little bit of
Hmm.
ago, those people are in your congregations,
Yeah.
pastors
Right.
and ministry leaders, right? They are sitting there. They may have a lot of shame
Hmm.
around that work
Hmm.
hurt. And so they may not be willing to come forward and talk about it very
Hmm.
easily. Also, if work is not something that's talked about frequently from the pulpit, they may not know where work fits in the life of the church. When we have a theology of work that we talk about, that we celebrate. So I think it's really important to have both a theology of work that is big enough to contain somebody's work hurt and to
Mm.
understand where that fits in
Yeah.
God's redemptive story. But then also to really dive in and know what's going on, and to invite people to share about that. I know my friends at Maine to Flourish, and Tom
Mm.
Nelson at Christ
Hmm.
Community in Kansas City, which is where I did my pastoral residency.
Mm.
They're really big on encouraging pastors to do workplace visits. So a
Yeah.
part of your week is going to meet somebody at their office, or going to have lunch with somebody. So you're talking with the engineer or the
Mm.
accountant or the teacher, and really getting to know what their work life is
Yeah.
like. And I think that's such a great opportunity to begin to pray and exercise a new form of pastoral care
Yeah.
for people who are in the pews, because um, this work hurt is it's really challenging, and it can just be so dramatic. And for some people, it can touch so many aspects of their life. I think
Yeah.
right now, especially, the time that we're recording this, I've talked recently to a pastor in Washington, D.C.,
Hmm.
and he serves a congregation that is primarily composed of people who work for the federal government, many of whom are now unemployed.
Wow.
Right. So that's a really huge pastoral concern, because now you have your
Yeah.
tithing base is not bringing in income,
Yeah.
which is a challenge. But you have all these people that are hurting because they were doing a job that they loved and it's
Yeah.
gone. Or I think about, I live not far from Atlanta, which is where the CDC is, and I think about church
Hmm.
communities there that have a lot of CDC employees there who have lost their jobs, and we can
Yeah.
extrapolate that around the country.
Hmm.
But there are a lot of people that are really deeply hurting right
Yeah.
now. And for pastors to exercise care there, I think
Hmm.
is really, really important,
Yeah.
to step in and to say, I see you, and this is just the end of one chapter in your
Right.
story, and God
Right.
and his mercy in some time is going to redeem this.
Yeah. Have you seen any ways that churches have sort of engaged to help people navigate
Y-
that?
I haven't yet,
Hmm.
but I would love to hear stories of
Yeah.
that. And so, I haven't yet heard that. But I think some really tangible ways that can happen, is
Yeah.
just thinking about, especially if they're congregation members that are still employed, what
Uh-huh.
does it look like to share with one another, like we see in Acts? So,
Yeah.
people losing employment
Mm.
is losing a paycheck if they don't get severance, losing benefits, potentially losing the ability to care for their children. And so those are major gaps that are not very easily and quickly filled. So, what
Yeah.
would it look like if the church came and provided childcare while parents are looking for
Yeah.
new jobs? Because looking for new jobs is a full-time job. It takes
Yeah.
so much effort and
Yeah.
energy. Or they're
Yeah.
going to networking.
Yeah.
Or what would happen if benevolence ministries at the churches said, hey, we can't do a lot, but we're going to cover your groceries for a
Mm-hmm.
couple of weeks, or something like that? Because
Yeah.
these the like really quick loss of income and benefits is really challenging. And
Yeah.
I didn't lose my job. I transitioned jobs, but I had to transition insurance and go into
Mm-hmm.
the healthcare.gov
Mm.
portal, which was really frustrating.
Yeah.
I'm glad that we have that provision, but it was
Sure.
really frustrating. It took a lot of work to get all
Mm-hmm.
those things, a lot of phone calls, a lot of paperwork to get everything set up and organized, just to make sure that my family had insurance coverage.
Yeah.
Um, and I think if people are having to go through that, it's a lot of stress on
Yeah.
top of trying to find a new job and make
Mm-hmm.
ends meet, especially in like places like DC, where the cost of living is
Yeah.
astronomical.
Yeah. I think that's some really good insight, and we can extrapolate advice from that. Being, uh, provide some resources, set up some resources, maybe find some, because not everybody's good at paperwork. Like I don't like it. I don't like having to do research online and all this stuff and trying to figure out what's the next thing and how do I fill out this form. And if churches can provide people who are good at that stuff for those who are going through these difficult transitions, that can be super helpful.
Oh
And then
yeah.
also just emotional and mental and spiritual care as well, as you're kind of
Hmm.
talking about. So one of the things that we talk about here at the Church Leadership Institute a lot is adaptive leadership, which is basically leading through disruption and change. And sometimes it's change that we know has to happen, but sometimes it's, and so we kind of initiate the change just because things around us have changed. But then sometimes the change is thrust upon us, and it's like, how do we figure out how to get through this change. And so, right, when we're navigating change, there's fear, there's loss. And so when I think about work hurt, I mean, all of that is in there. And so maybe just sort of in closing here, if you have any thoughts on, you've actually said a lot already, but maybe just kind of some concluding summary thoughts in terms of how to, how to navigate the loss, the fear, and I'm thinking about support, but we've talked about that. But let's think about loss and fear, and how can we best navigate that when we're going through disruptive times like this?
Yeah. It's so important to grieve the loss. It's so important to grieve it, to name what has been lost, to acknowledge the fear and what's there, right? And to know that sometimes that fear may manifest as other emotions. It could manifest as like anger or withdrawal, whatever it is, like really get to the root. And again, that's where like community, a coach, a therapist can really help you do that work. If you're not great at getting beneath the surface there, if you have access to that help, that's really important. But I want to talk about like just the really basics of navigating that change. And this is something that I discovered in my life, and I see it in scripture, and I wrote about it in the book. And that's it's a term I call in the book everyday faithfulness. And it's just show up and do what God has put in front of you to do. Like put one foot in front of the other. And so if you are someone that is out of a job, that's probably getting on Indeed, getting on LinkedIn, and doing the work of looking for jobs and putting in applications. As tedious and as discouraging as that can be sometimes, but just to show up to that. Maybe it's showing up to love your family and to continue volunteering at church, continue coaching Little League. If you're in a toxic environment and can't get out, it's showing up and continuing to be faithful there, to do your work as well as you can, and to try to honor God and love the people that are around you as best you can. It won't be perfect. It probably won't be to the extent that you would like to, because my guess is if you're in that environment, your well-being is being diminished to some extent. But I've seen in my life, and I see points of this in scripture, where God meets people in these ordinary moments where they're just being faithful to what's in front of them. So, right, we see all the glamorous call stories in scripture, right? Abraham, Moses, right? We can go on and on. They're all doing ordinary things. We forget about that. Like Abraham is doing what nomads do, right? He is traveling with his family. And Moses is doing what shepherds do. He's tending the flock, right? They weren't on these like mountain retreats. They weren't trying to do anything that was really like noteworthy or be a superhero. They're just doing what was in front of them to do. And God met them in really profound ways in that moment. And so for me, when I think about that, I'm just reminded that when we're in these moments where there is tremendous change and upheaval, like we might just want to pull the covers over our head and stay in bed and not get up and face the world. Or I think the other extreme is we can just get really chaotic and scramble and try to do anything that's going to feel meaningful or to, ease that pain and that suffering to get into something that feels better work-wise. But what if we took just a steadier course and just get back to the basics and show up, do everyday faithfulness, and follow Jesus wherever he has us in that moment?
Yeah. I love that. Everyday faithfulness, right? Keep showing up. And just reflecting the way that worked out for me. Like looking back, I didn't have that word, but after I got voted out of that church, another pastor who knew me and was a friend, he said, "Hey, I'm going to be out of town. I need someone to guest preach for me." And at first I was like, "No way, I'm not doing that anymore." And my wife said, "You should do it. Just do it." And so I was like, "Okay, I'll do it." So it was, so I didn't think I'd be a pastor again after that, but that sort of recurring, showing up in a new way, in that case, made the way possible into the
Mhm.
future. So anyway, affirming what you're saying here, Meryl. Thank you so much for all of this really great reflection and way of thinking about our experiences with work. If people wanted to find out more about you and the work that you're doing, where could they go?
Yeah, thanks. The easiest way is merylherr.com. That's my website where you can sign up for my Substack. And you can also find me on LinkedIn and Instagram if you're a social media person. So those are the best places. And again, my book is When Work Hurts. And if you have a work hurt story that you want to share with
Hmm.
me, you can email me at whenworkhurts@gmail.com.
Great. Great. Good to know. Well, thank you again for a great conversation. And Meryl, thanks so much for all the good work that you're doing.
Thanks, Marcus. It's been fun.